Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar by CIPS. My name is Rita Abrahamson. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And I just have the simple and very pleasurable task today of introducing to you Stephen Ellis, one of the absolutely central figures in contemporary African studies. So I'm very excited about that. Stephen Ellis is Desmond Tutu Professor at the Free University in Amsterdam. And he's also a senior researcher at the African Studies Center in Leiden. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that Stephen Ellis is one of the people who have really helped shape African studies in the last 2 decades. He is an extremely prolific writer, which is one of the impressive things about him. But even more so, he's one of those people who seems somehow to manage always to have his finger on the pulse of the African continent, which means that whenever he publishes something, whether it's a book or an article, he's not just contributing to debates, but he's actually setting the tone of those debates. He's actually sort of saying, this is what you guys should have seen. And then all of the rest of us who follows kind of have to engage with Stephen Ellis and what he's already said. So he has managed always, I think, to be a step ahead of a lot of other people who work within the broad field of African studies. A good example of the way in which he is setting the tone of debates is his recent work on the drugs trade in Africa, and the drugs trade in West Africa is shown, before anyone else really were thinking about this, how the global drugs trade is now centered more and more on West Africa, and what the possible consequences of that might be for the continent. A lot of his work, I'm sure many of you will know his book, The Mask of Anarchy, which is a really perceptive and interesting study on civil war in Liberia, and has become one of those books that everyone who writes about civil war in Africa has to look at, The Mask of Anarchy. His work on religion in Africa is also one of those debates that have been centrally shaped by Stephen Ellis and Gary Terha, who wrote a book together called Worlds of Power. So religion, politics, the world of the spirits in Africa is another debate that Stephen Ellis has been absolutely crucial in forming. I think his most controversial work, and I hope Stephen won't mind me saying so, he's no stranger to controversy, I think it's fair to say, but the book that he was a co-author of called The Criminalization of the State in Africa, I remember when that came out, I think in 1999, it caused a lot of debate and a lot of controversy, but what it has done is really helped open up a whole set of debates about how we think about power, how we think about the state and the reproduction of the state in Africa. And in that sense, I think we should all feel incredibly privileged to have Stephen Ellis as our speaker this afternoon. He has written, when we invited him to come to CIPS to speak, I thought that his most recent book was called Seasons of Rain. But in between sending him the email and checking the internet, he'd published another book, which is on the ANC in exile. I have not yet myself had a chance to read it, but from the reviews that I've seen, people are already saying this is going to change the debate about the ANC. So again, we should feel extremely privileged. He is here, though, to speak about, or to give us a talk based on what I thought until recently was his latest book, which is called Seasons of Rain. And this is it's a big book with big ideas on a lot of the contemporary developments in Africa, really the state of Africa today. And in typical Ellis fashion, he kind of keeps poking at us to challenge all those predominant images that we have about Africa that perhaps are kind of leftovers from an era gone by. So with nothing more than that, I would hope that you can join me in welcoming Stephen. I think we are very privileged to have him here, and we can look forward to a very engaging talk. So.
Thank you very much, Rita. It was putting me in mind of the Oscars awards ceremony yesterday, but rather an extravagant introduction. But anyway, well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and you will be delighted to know this is my first ever visit to Canada, and I was extremely afraid of the weather, and I even emailed here to say, what do I do if it's minus 30? And she said, put lots of clothes on. So, but I'm glad to say I'm surviving. Some of you who follow Africa may remember 13 years ago when The Economist magazine, which of course is well known, had a cover called The Hopeless Continent, and it was an outline map of Africa, and filled in was a picture of a child soldier with a machine gun or something, and that created a great deal of controversy, especially among African intellectuals who are absolutely outraged. And of course, it was an image of Africa that we're all familiar with, the one of the continent of poverty and of war. Now, in recent years, the business press, the Anglo-American business press, has gone close to another extreme about the place that the Victorians used to refer to as the Dark Continent, Africa. The Economist, the Financial Times, and other leading organs of business opinion in the Anglo-American world now tend to portray Africa as a continent of opportunity, business opportunity. So, in fact, the Economist, perhaps a few months ago, perhaps apologising for its earlier misstep, had a cover called The Hopeful Continent. We have McKinsey, the well-known management consultancy company. They published an influential study in 2010 called Lions on the Move, and obviously the reference is to the Asian tigers, and suggesting that Africa's the place to be if you're in business. Ernst & Young regularly publishes what it calls Africa attractiveness surveys, in which they try and measure the business, how attractive is Africa for business. Now, so for people who like to think in those terms, you could say this is all evidence that Africa is at last becoming developed. Now, my own opinion is that Africa is indeed developing, but what's interesting is it's not in ways that, as far as I know, anybody had foreseen. Now, the enthusiasm of business analysts arises above all from Africa's economic growth figures in a world whose most developed economies are growing slowly or not at all. The International Monetary Fund estimated last year that Africa as a whole would grow by 5% during 2012. And I wrote these sentences a few weeks ago, so by now they may have a more precise figure. But it's a high rate of growth by world standards. By 2015, Africa's overall economic output will have grown more than fourfold since the start of this century. Africa's external debt has meanwhile fallen from 63% of gross domestic product in 2000 to 22.2% in 2012. And I need hardly say that by European standards, and by certainly US standards, it's a very low level of indebtedness. These impressive figures reflect a rapid expansion of consumer markets, to a great extent simply because Africa's population is growing. In fact, Africa's population growth since the middle of the last century has been the fastest of any substantial area in the entire history of the world. Let me say that again. In the whole, as far as we know, in the whole history of the world, there's never been a large area like more than just one city or one country or one small region which has grown at such a speed, whose population has grown at such a speed. At the same time, the continent's consumer markets are better integrated than ever before, thanks to improved communications in general and mobile phones in particular. Another significant change in Africa's economic situation is in regard to state finances. Some African governments are now issuing bonds, as is usual in the developed world. Until last year, only 13 out of 54 countries in Africa had issued foreign currency denominated international bonds. But now countries coming to the capital bond market for the first time include Nigeria, Senegal and Zambia. And in the near future, Angola, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda and Mozambique are all expected to issue bonds of their own. They're being welcomed by investors looking for new high-yielding markets, to the extent that Nigeria's borrowing costs have recently been lower than those of Spain. In short, Africa is becoming less reliant on aid and is becoming more than ever part of the mainstream of world business and finance. The problem for any observer, whether an investor or an academic analyst, is to distinguish what is mere froth from what is substance in figures like these. In discussing this matter, a couple of things are worth saying right at the beginning. The first is that statistics in Africa are generally unreliable, and this applies to economic growth figures as much as to any other. So whatever figures you see, take them with a grain of salt, or maybe 2 grains of salt. A second point is that the financial world is notoriously prone to enthusiasm about new opportunities, and that such enthusiasm creates a dynamic of its own, sometimes called the herd instinct. European and North American bankers and investors, surveying home markets overloaded with debt, have a vested interest in talking up business opportunities in Africa, which they often see as the world's last emerging market. And I think we need to be aware of the danger that they're creating a new investment bubble, which, like all bubbles, will one day burst. Nevertheless, the feeling that something has changed in Africa is unmistakable. Infrastructure is improving in most countries. Africa has new partners in the shape of China, Brazil, India, and others. And if only because of the passage of time, the shadow cast by the colonial period is less obtrusive than it once was. Most countries in Africa gained political independence in the 1960s, which of course is now half a century ago. Since the median age in Africa is under 20 compared to over 40 in Europe, this means that most Africans have no memory of the colonial period. They're just too young. They're even too young to remember the 1960s and the 1970s, when regimes presided over by Africans rather than Europeans continued to make abundant use of the practices, routines, and mentalities of their colonial predecessors. In historical terms, those decades, the 60s and the 70s, were the true post-colonial period. I mean, as you're all aware, there's an influential school of thought regarding post-colonialism, and my point is that in historical terms, I think the post-colonial period was the 60s and the 70s in most of Africa. Changes since the 1970s have been important enough for it to be clear that we're now living in a new era, one that as yet has no name, but that we can distinguish from the post-colonial period, properly speaking. If I were pushed to say when the post-colonial period, as I regard it, came to an end, I would say it happened sometime in the 1990s, after the disappearance of the last of the great European empires. And let me be clear that I'm referring to the Soviet Union, which we can now see was the final form taken by the Russian Empire. So the last of the great colonial empires was not the British or the French, it was the Russian Empire in the form of the Soviet Union. To understand Africa's changing place in the world, we need to look not just at the continent itself, but above all to understand what has happened to the world as a whole. We're seeing the arrival of a number of new power centres, of which China is only the most significant. Above all, there's a sense that the West no longer represents a model of development, the outcome of a historical process that the rest of the world must follow if it is to avoid being left behind. There are now plenty of countries that show hallmarks of development without following the same path as North America or Europe, and that have no intention of ever doing so. Understanding the world now emerging is the single biggest intellectual challenge to students of international affairs. Europe has a problem in this regard, since, having become accustomed to regard itself as a collection of rich countries that have collectively overcome many questions of conflict and poverty, it risks lacking the mental agility required to accept how profoundly things have changed. In regard to Africa, the North Atlantic countries generally suffer from a very specific handicap, not just the fact that they're a bit complacent about their own situation. To put it bluntly, they have for many years held a peculiar set of illusions about Africa. This habit dates from as long ago as the 18th century, when European intellectuals began to see Africa as a continent stuck in an earlier phase of human history and uniquely in need of being saved, especially from the slave trade as operated by Europeans themselves. It was for this reason that the world's first modern public campaigning group, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, was founded in London in 1787. Through the period of colonialism, the articulation of a scientific racism, and the assumption of a civilizing mission, for over 2 centuries, generations of Europeans and North Americans have been accustomed to seeing Africa as a continent in need of help that could only come from outside. It's sometimes pointed out, I think correctly, that Europeans have traditionally regarded Africa as a sort of distorting mirror, gazing into which helps Europeans know who they are by reference to who they are not. The historic concept of a European mission to civilize Africa is the ancestor of the idea of development that is still with us today. In its modern form, development dates from the eventful period of new thinking and institution building after the end of the Second World War. The USA especially tried to reshape the world in forms most amenable to it, as President Truman made clear in his inaugural address of the 20th of January 1949. And he stated in that address, I quote him, "We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas." That was the inaugural address by President Truman. Introduced on a large scale in late colonial times, scientific development was intended to result in a continent of healthy, educated people who could both produce and consume in the same way as those living in the developed world, and to cultivate elites able to govern in the manner deemed appropriate to a nation state. Now, it's this concept of development, as I've just very rapidly summarized it, which I put to you now has to change. We should no longer regard Africa as a continent in permanent need of help, of a sort that can be identified by our technocrats and social scientists. It is a full member of the world. But the fact is, it's a full member of a world whose rules of operation are changing fast in directions none of us can predict. Now, to be sure, in some respects, Africa's recent economic achievements, which I started off by just briefly sketching, can be seen as a notable success for the project of development. African businesses have become international players, such as the Angolan oil company Sonangol, which has offices in London and Houston, owns oil interests in Iraq and Brazil, and runs a holding company with Chinese partners in Singapore. Angolan investment in Portugal, of course significantly, or maybe ironically, the former colonial power, is part of a total outward investment that amounted to $1.2 billion in 2010, the most by any sub-Saharan country. There is evidence of a dynamic economic life and a burgeoning middle class in many African countries. A visitor to any major African city cannot fail to be struck by the signs, from the number of shopping malls to the size of the traffic jams. The sources of the wealth needed to support a middle-class consumer style remain mysterious, but they include income from the export of raw materials, remittances from the African diaspora overseas, the return of professionals who've worked abroad, and credit supplied by the new generation of African banks. Actually, many members of Africa's new middle classes are indebted to an extent that is worrying. For example, credit to Kenyan private households increased by 32.5% in 1 year, 2011, to reach $2 billion. I should add at once that the new middle class affluence to be seen in many parts of Africa exists amid great inequality. As Kofi Annan puts it, extreme disparities in income are slowing the pace of poverty reduction and hampering the development of broad-based economic growth. This is actually true of probably most parts of the world, including the USA, many European countries, and also China and India, the growth of inequality. The concerns about the nature of Africa's growth expressed by Kofi Annan are not fanciful, but they may be misdirected since they apply to the world as a whole and not just to Africa. Still, I may list some of the ways in which it is becoming apparent just how much Africa's situation is inseparable from that of the world as a whole. As regards population, Africa is at present home to 1 billion people, and if present birth rates continue, or I should say present, not just birth rates, but population rates, it's set to have some 2 billion people, or close to a quarter of the world's population, by the middle of this century. Considering such growth in country terms is startling and possibly terrifying. Uganda, for example, I've taken Uganda pretty much at random, had 6.8 million people in 1960 and has 35 million people today. By 2060, it is projected to have almost 113 million people. I mean, this is a rate of population growth that is absolutely staggering, and like I say, the fastest ever, as far as we know, in the whole history of the world. Africa has problems providing jobs for the large numbers of young people who leave education each year. This too is characteristic not just of Africa, but of most countries these days, not only of underdeveloped ones. and many of the world's most developed countries have unemployment rates of close to 10% or even more. Since there is a consensus that young people who experience unemployment on leaving school are likely to bear the consequences throughout their lives, it is likely that even rich countries with stable populations may be currently creating a set of social problems that are going to be with them for decades. In the case of Africa, it's widely held that the revolutions in North Africa in the last couple of years, the Arab Spring, were fueled by large numbers of educated but unemployed young people with access to social media. Continuing population increase will surely create political pressures throughout the continent that can easily be imagined. It will place still further pressure on infrastructure in the vast new cities that have arisen in recent decades, and which, in the case of West Africa, seemed destined to absorb further numbers of immigrants from the Sahel. And what of climate change? This is by definition a global problem, but that does not diminish the problems it may bring to individual regions of the world. Again, to take just one example, a recent study of the Zambezi River system in southern Africa predicts that the water that feeds the river Zambezi is expected to decrease by between 26 and 40% over the next 4 decades, while such rains as do fall will be more intense, causing floods. It's also useful to bear in mind the global context when considering one of the most prominent changes in Africa since the end of the Cold War, namely the emergence of so-called failed states. I won't say here why I call them, I don't really like the term failed states, and I won't go into that here, but I'm using it for want of a better one. This is an expression that appears to have been invented by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in the late 1990s. Sometimes people, diplomats and so on, now speak of fragile states, but the meaning seems to be no different from failed states. I speak of so-called failed states because even in places where the bureaucratic apparatus of the state has become incapable of implementing policy over an entire national territory, states continue to serve certain interests. By and large, even countries with failed organs of state remain governed, although often by informal hierarchies and unofficial instruments than formal ones. Failing or failed states may nevertheless contain enormous new cities like Lagos, Kinshasa, and others that are hubs of commercial and political activity. Places like these are already among the world's largest metropoles, bigger than any city in Europe. No one knows how many people live in Africa's megacities, which is unsurprising since their societies lack the bureaucratic routines that generate statistics. Without accurate statistics, it is hard for bureaucrats and planners to apply the conventional instruments of management. Town planning, sewerage, health services and so on are matters that would conventionally be described as needing attention of a sort that only a government can coordinate. And yet, we've noted, most African states are conventionally placed on lists of those that are failing or failed or fragile, which the distinctions are not clear between those. Now, at this point, I think it's interesting and relevant to note that the words statistics and state are related, as too are the words policy and police. All were originally coined in regard to a type of political and administrative arrangement that in the history of Europe arose in the early modern period. A similar system was imposed on Africa by colonial government, and indeed that imposition was perhaps the fundamental point at issue in the matter of colonialism, as I will shortly but briefly discuss in due course. Yet the period of colonial rule is now receding into the distance. Some of its structures, that is to say the structures introduced by colonial government, have eroded, and although others still exist in a familiar form, in many cases their substance has changed. Increasingly, Africa is governed by methods that have roots in the continent's own deeper history, including, of course, the history of colonialism, but not in textbook methods of public administration. And my friend Gérard Prunier likes to be amusing and refer to what he calls successful failed states, which is actually, I mean, it's a funny expression, but it actually makes quite a lot of sense. Places that, by any normal standard, look like failed states, but especially if they have oil or some other major resource, seem able to reproduce themselves for the foreseeable future. The relative lack in Africa of states with efficient bureaucracies that are able to manage major national issues is a matter that concerns more than just Africans themselves. This is so not only for humanitarian reasons, but also because Africa's resources are increasingly important to the world as a whole. The remarkable upsurge of Chinese commerce with Africa is connected to the fact that Africa, while far from being the treasure house of minerals that it is sometimes said to be, does contain many of the natural resources that China needs for its continuing industrialization, including, of course, oil. 30% of China's oil imports come from Africa, and Angola, just Angola on its own, competes with Saudi Arabia and Iran for the position of China's top oil supplier. Africa provides no less than 89% of the global production of platinum, 81% of chromium, and large percentages of many other minerals. Above all, Africa constitutes one of the last reserves of underused agricultural land. This seems certain to be a major factor in Africa's relations with other parts of the world over the next decades, as the world finds ways to feed a population set to rise to maybe 9 billion by the middle of this century. Africa's unique role as a potential producer of agricultural goods has resulted in major investments by outside players in African farmland for the production of palm oil and biofuel, as well as food crops. Foreign demand for African land is often described, when you read about it in the press or see on television, it's often described as a land grab, and it's often interpreted in the European media, at least, as a raid by outside interests that threatens the livelihood of Africa's rural populations. Less known in Europe, at least, is that some foreign investors come to grief because of the lack of land markets in Africa, finding themselves paying several times over for use rights over the same piece of land and still being unsure of the security of their tenure. But I have to say at once, it's very, very hard to do research in this area, and it's very hard to find hard facts or reliable information. So there may be people here who've done such research, but it remains a very vague subject. Now, these last observations concerning land and food and agriculture raise some important points, including one related to the earlier question that I raised about how Africa's growing population will be employed in the years to come. Until now, the classic path of economic development, as followed in Europe, Japan, the USA, and China, involves mass migration from rural areas to cities, where newcomers become labourers in factories that are the motor of industrialisation. It is conceivable that this could happen in parts of Africa, with Asian and other investors building new factories in Africa to benefit from cheap labour in the way that has happened in Southeast Asia, as industrialising countries move up the value chain into high technology and services and outsource more basic manufacturing to low-wage countries with large and compliant labour forces of first-generation migrants from rural areas. However, there are reasons to suppose that this pattern may not be followed in Africa. The economist John Page finds little evidence of structural change in Africa's recent economic growth. The region's 1995 to 2005 growth turnaround and its recovery from the 2008 global financial crisis, was driven primarily by new mineral discoveries, rising commodity prices, and the recovery of domestic demand. He concludes that it is doubtful whether, in the absence of structural change, sufficient growth can be sustained for Africa to reach middle-income levels by 2025. Many parts of the continent lack infrastructure. Perhaps more importantly, few countries have much historical experience of the type of state that imposes social disciplines of the sort necessary for factory work. Disciplinarian states enduring over generations have an important role also in offering the security that potential investors seek. We may, for example, consider the case of Madagascar, which successfully created an export processing zone that flourished in the 1990s, attracting investors in textile factories, chiefly from Asia, and creating hundreds of thousands of generally low-wage jobs, particularly for women. A coup in 2009 caused the US government to exclude Madagascar from the provisions of its African Growth and Opportunities Act. thereby at a single stroke destroying the rationale of many of the textile factories, which were only there really to service the American market. And those factories promptly closed down. Cases like this may cause Asian investors to think twice about large-scale investment in factory production in Africa. A classic theme of the literature on business and economics is that investors seek a stable political climate, and the existence of conditions that will allow them to enter into contracts secure in the knowledge that they will not be subject to arbitrary dispossession, and that an efficient and fair system of legal arbitration exists in the event of a contract dispute. However, recent history must cause us to wonder whether such conditions are really essential for capitalist growth, as so often been asserted. Most notably, China has grown into the world's second largest economy under a single-party state that does not respect the rule of law and with a high level of corruption. There are now up to 1 million Chinese expatriates and settlers in Africa, many of them involved in business, where they appear to find success using methods familiar to them from their home country. Among the many open questions this raises are whether Chinese investors and Chinese entrepreneurs will invest in large-scale manufacturing in Africa, notwithstanding the lack of an appropriate climate according to conventional wisdom. I mean, I regard this as an open question. We just don't know what's going to happen. One possibility, certainly not the only one, is that, in the words of a veteran South African journalist, Stanley Ace, the Chinese will be like goats. After staying in a country for the required period, extracting the minerals they want, their legacy is scrub, rocks, and sand. A further possibility, a more edifying one, is that Africa will benefit from its agricultural potential in such a way as to provide work for the millions of new job seekers of coming years. This could happen, for example, through the development of intensive small-scale production, revolutionizing the existing agricultural sector. It could conceivably happen through investment in plantations, foreign or African, and large-scale agribusiness. Whatever actually happens, it seems clear that the policies adopted by African governments will be crucial in deciding eventual outcomes. So at this point, we're brought back to the fact that few African states seem to be evolving efficient bureaucratic machines that are able to articulate and implement a national policy. And yet at the same time, the continent is home to some dynamic economies and huge metropoles that are hubs of commercial and political power. Perhaps one or two states will eventually emerge that are associated with efficient bureaucracies, such as in Rwanda and Ethiopia, both of which happen to be countries where such bureaucracies existed long before colonial times. But the number of such countries is likely to be small. The Africa of the future may consist of a small number of relatively powerful states that are able to finance themselves by recourse to capital markets and that exert influence over neighbours that do not have this option available, dividing the continent into a series of centres and peripheries. By coincidence, this also seems a likely future for the European Union, which seems to be evolving into an agglomeration of creditor and debtor states that will generate new hierarchies of dependence and resentment in defiance of standard models. So I'm suggesting it's not just Africa, but other parts of the world, such as Europe, may be contributing to a kind of new map of international relations. So I'm coming to the end, and if I must summarise, I will do so by saying that Africa's high levels of economic growth, even if they are sustained for a lengthy period, will not automatically lead, other than in perhaps a handful of countries, to the type of economic and political development that has been regarded for 2 or more generations as the standard model. The vision of development that predominated from the 1940s until recently arose from a very specific political context, that of the post-World War II settlement, which witnessed, among other things, the longest economic boom in history, the Cold War, the dismantling of the great European empires, and a willful ignorance of the fact that the world's resources are both finite and quite fragile. These conditions have now changed, and it behoves us to understand the world as it has now become. I thank you for your attention.